Ivan Turgenev was born in 1818 in Russia. He lived on an estate that had been granted to an ancestor of his by Ivan IV, who in English is better known as Ivan the Terrible. Growing up, he had a governess who helped him and his two brothers to become fluent in French, German, and English. He studied for a while in Berlin, and while he was there, he was very impressed with Germany and became convinced that Russia could benefit from the ideas of the Enlightenment and applying them to its own culture. There's this story about him being arrested, but I don't quite understand it and I'm not sure if it's true. Turgenev wrote an obituary for Gogol after he had died, and the censors in St. Petersburg, where Turgenev was living, forbade the publication of this obituary. So then he went to Moscow and had it published there. And so I guess he was imprisoned for a month, maybe because he wasn't supposed to do that. He wasn't supposed to try to publish it somewhere else after it had already been censored in one place. But it seems just as likely that it could be fine to publish it in the other city if the censors in the other city are okay with it. So I'm not sure of the details of that incident, and they're not easy to find. Turgenev wrote at least 7 novels, of which the best known is the one that we're going to be looking at today, Fathers and Sons, as well as 8 novellas, a short story collection called Sportsman's Notebook, some other short stories, 9 plays, and 1 book of poetry. He spent the last years of his life, from what I can tell, it seems like the last 9 years of his life, in the town of Bougival, which is outside of Paris. He had a dacha built there, and that's where he stayed. And this town is notable for a few reasons. One is that a number of Impressionist painters, including Monet and Renoir, but also Alfred Sisley and Bertha Morisot, who are not quite as well known, painted scenes along the Seine there. And they now have 6 plaques in what they call the Impressionist Walk in the town, where you can go down and see the exact spot where these different paintings were painted. Bougival is also the place where the composer Bizet wrote his opera Carmen, which, if you're not familiar, has some of the most famous melodies ever in it. You would definitely recognize them. And Bougival was also the site for a long time of something called the Machine de Marly, which was an elaborate hydraulic pumping device for moving huge amounts of water from the Seine to Versailles. And it was originally built in the late 17th century. And at the time, it was very groundbreaking to be able to move so much water in this way, and involved 14 water wheels, each about 38 feet in diameter, powering 250 pumps to move water 500 feet vertically, from which point I guess it then flowed down toward Versailles, which was about 5 miles away. And I'm always interested in how the lives and influences of these various people in history overlap, and so I was interested to find that this place, Bougival, has these instances of writing, of music, of painting, and of engineering. So it's an interesting spot. It is outside of Paris, so maybe it's not that surprising, but certainly still worth noting. And it's also the place where Ivan Turgenev died in 1883. Fathers and Sons was published in 1862. And before I had read anything about the history of this novel in particular, it becomes very clear in this novel that you're dealing with some of the rumblings of what is going to later become the Bolshevik Revolution. And I didn't know that going in, but if you know some 19th and early 20th century Russian history, and you think about the date that this is being written and what some of the characters are talking about, it's very easy to place it in that context. And apparently, Turgenev wrote this book specifically to address what he saw as a schism between Russian liberals who wanted some kind of reform and a growing movement called Nihilism. And I was surprised to find that 19th century Russia is generally taken as the origin of nihilism, even broader philosophical nihilism in general. And this book in particular is credited with popularizing the term, a nihilist. One of the main characters identifies himself as such and articulates his views at some length and debates with other characters. And Kropotkin, a major 19th and early 20th century Russian anarchist, apparently liked Turgenev's portrayal of a nihilist in Bazarov, that's the character's name, more than some other novels that were more of a caricature of this viewpoint, but he still found some shortcomings in Bazarov as a representation of a nihilist. But so Kropotkin might have adjusted some things favorably. He might have rounded off some of Bazarov's sharp edges and corners, but generally he thought it was okay. And Kropotkin's view doesn't necessarily matter, except that he's somebody who would have advocated a lot of Bazarov's positions, and he was okay with this representation, which is saying something. Dmitry Pisarev, 19th century Russian literary critic and philosopher and proponent of nihilism, even coined the term Basarovism as an embrace of the style and manner of thinking of this character. And Turgenev himself was ambiguous about Basarov, saying, quote, "Did I want to abuse Basarov or extol him? I do not know myself, since I don't know whether I love him or hate him." End quote. So even Turgenev wasn't totally sure what he thought about this character. He might have been able to make up his mind if he had lived long enough to see where this was going. And some academic historians take nihilism to be a central component in the ideology of what would eventually become the Bolshevik Revolution. And indeed, you have guys like Vladimir Alexandrovich Rudnev, who was a Bolshevik journalist, economist, and was involved in some of the economic planning of the Soviet Union, and who later changed his last name to Bazarov in honor of this character and in support of his worldview. Though now I'm sort of curious exactly when, in what year, Turgenev said that about Bazarov, because this novel was published in 1862, and in 1866, there was an attempted assassination against Tsar Alexander II of Russia, who ruled from 1855 until he was successfully assassinated in 1881. There was an attempt in 1866 that failed, but then 15 years later, he was successfully assassinated by a group called Narodnaya Volya, which translates to the people's will, and is interesting and worth studying in some depth. But from what I can see, that group in particular was not involved in the 1866 attempt, though it took inspiration from it. And after the 1866 attempt, there was a crackdown on the nihilist movement in Russia because the would-be assassin Dmitry Karakozov was associated with this movement. So while the Bolshevik Revolution was still a half a century in the future, just 4 years after this book was published, someone who was apparently a proponent of nihilism tried to assassinate the Tsar. So I'd be curious to know whether Turgenev said that line about how he's not sure whether he likes Bazarov or hates him before or after this assassination attempt. That would be interesting to know. And alongside all of this political subtext, this is a story about, as the title suggests, fathers and sons. There are basically two sons in the story, Bazarov and Arkady. They're not brothers. They're two young guys. Bazarov is a little bit older, but they are the sons. And throughout the story, you meet Bazarov's parents and also Arkady's family. So you meet their fathers also, and you see those relationships between the fathers and the sons. And there's always this discussion about the new ideas and the habits of the younger generation and how the older generation reacts to it. So it's also a story about families. And while it may be tempting or comforting to imagine that every generation of fathers and sons has these kinds of disagreements, and while that may be true in some limited way, there are definitely periods, for example, the 1960s in America, maybe the 1860s in Russia, though certainly later in that century and into the beginning of the 20th century in Russia, where there was more radical change going on, and the differences between the fathers and the sons would have grown much more stark. And if you were to pick any of the other transitions from one generation to the next in history, most of them would involve differences that are much less than in these kinds of contexts. If you were to take, for example, the thoughts and actions of fathers and sons in 1740s Pennsylvania, just as a random example, a time period about which we don't hear very much, because things were probably just sort of humming along. Or, for example, the 1560s in Norway. There may be these differences that people often think a certain way when they're 20, and they often think another way when they're 50, and so those differences would be there. But they wouldn't be like the differences in the periods that I'm talking about. And I think it would be a mistake to say that some of the kinds of differences that are illustrated in Fathers and Sons in this novel are universal and can be applied to every generation. They apply more to certain historical contexts than to others. But now we can get into some passages from Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev. And at one point, this character Bazarov says, quote, 2 and 2 make 4, nothing but that matters, end quote. And this in a way resembles the whole novel of We. Here, Bazarov is seemingly invoking the most strict kind of mathematical logic, that you need only follow these very clear inferences and you can figure out everything that you need from there. And We, as we looked at in the previous episode, depicts an entire world that is supposedly governed by this kind of mathematical logic. Now, both of these examples are a little bit unsettling for me because I've spent a lot of time studying politics, and my job is related to that. And over the years, it's become increasingly clear to me how unclear everything is, how difficult it is to know anything for certain, especially when you're talking about politics. And for me, as I've talked about, revisiting math as an adult has been spiritually very satisfying because it has this clarity and certainty in it. And so I like the notion of starting from that kind of crystalline logic and trying not to leave it ever and moving only in that way. And I don't like it when I see this proto-Bolshevik character advocating the same. Or 60 years later, Yevgeny Zamyatin, who was literally a Bolshevik, mocking the same or satirizing or warning about the same in We. So if we're going to be honest in our thinking and acknowledge tensions or contradictions in it, that's one for me that I've been thinking about recently, is I like the philosophical value of math, but I'm also getting some warning signals about it from sources that I care about. And another line that stood out to me, Turgenev writes, quote, "For in all the world, is there a more entrancing spectacle than that of a young, handsome mother with in her arms a healthy child," end quote. And that's outside of a quote. That's not a character saying it. That just seems to have been a thought that Turgenev had that was suitable for the context where it's placed. And another part of this book that's very interesting is that you don't only have the conversations between the fathers and the sons, between Bazarov and Arkady's uncle. They clash a fair amount. But you also have the discussions among the fathers and among the sons. Arkady's father and Arkady's uncle talk to each other, both about their sons and about their own views. And Arkady and Bazarov, the two younger guys, also talk to each other about exactly what their views are. Because Bazarov is a little older and mentoring Arkady a little bit in these views, which Arkady mostly already holds, but he's learning of the details from Bazarov. And at one point, Arkady and Bazarov are talking, and Arkady says, quote, "And is nature also rubbish?" queried Arkady with a musing glance at the mottled fields where they lay basking in the soft, kindly rays of the morning sun. "Nature is rubbish, at least in the sense in which you understand her. She is not a church, but a workshop wherein man is the laborer," end quote. So the nihilist Bazarov is against any kind of sentimentality, even for nature. A little further, Turgenev writes, quote, "At this moment there came wafted to their ears the long-drawn strains of a cello, on which a sensitive but inexperienced hand was playing Schubert's Erwartung. Like honey did the voluptuous melody suffuse the air." "Who is the musician?" asked Bazarov in astonishment. "My father." "What? Your father plays the cello?" "He does." "At his age?" "Yes, he's only 44. Bazarov burst out laughing. "Why do you laugh?" asked Arkady. "Pardon me, but the idea that your father, a man of 44, a paterfamilias, and a notable in the county, should play the cello." And he continued laughing, though Arkady, for all his reverence for his mentor, failed to accomplish even a smile, end quote. So Bazarov is laughing at Arkady's dad playing the cello. He thinks that's not suitable for a man his age. Or maybe for anyone, but in this case he's just talking about an older guy ahead of the family doing so. And we'll skip ahead a little bit more, and here we need to know that Nikolai Petrovich is Arkady's father. So he's the guy who is playing the cello, and they're going to talk about him a little bit more here. And Nikolai is walking towards them when he hears them talking, and so then he stops to try to hear what they're saying. Turgenev writes, quote, "You do not understand my father," Arkady was saying. Nikolai Petrovich halted instead of revealing himself. "Oh, he is a good fellow enough," replied Bazarov, "but also he is a man on the shelf, a man whose song has been sung." Though Nikolai Petrovich strained his ears, he failed to catch Arkady's reply. So the man on the shelf lingered for a minute or two, then walked slowly back to the house. "For the past 3 days I have noted him reading Pushkin," continued Bazarov. "You ought to explain to him that no good can come of that, for he is no longer a boy, and ought to have shaken himself free of such fiddlesticks. Who would desire to be a romanticist? give him something practical. For instance, let me consider. For a start, give him Buchner's Stoff und Kraft. Good, Arkady's tone was approving. Stoff und Kraft is at least written in a popular style. The same day, Nikolai Petrovich was sitting with his brother. At length he said, I find that you and I are men on the shelf, that our songs have been sung, and perhaps Bazarov is right. Yet I confess that one thing hurts me, and that is that, though I had hoped to draw nearer to Arkady, I am being left in the rear, and he is forever marching ahead. No longer do he and I understand one another. And why is he forever marching ahead? Asked Paul Petrovich indignantly. How comes he to stand at such a distance from us? The reason is simply the ideas which that precious nihilist is putting into his head. For myself, I detest the fellow, and think him a charlatan. Also, I am certain that in spite of his frogs, he is making no real progress in physics. End quote. So Bazarov criticizes Arkady's father reading Pushkin, and instead recommends that he read Buchner. But also, the tone that he uses is actually one as if he were the father. He says, he is no longer a boy and ought to have shaken himself free of such fiddlesticks. This is something that an older person would say about a younger person. And instead here Bazarov is talking about his friend's dad. He shouldn't be a romanticist, he should be practical. Then Nikolai, Arkady's father, after overhearing some of this conversation, goes to his brother and uses these same idioms to him. He says, I find that you and I are men on the shelf, that our songs have been sung. Now, I don't know if the original Russian phrases that are used there were phrases that the younger generation would have been more likely to use than the older one, but I interpret that as being the father trying to talk a little bit like the younger guys. And his brother, Pavel or Paul, just blames Bazarov and his ideas for the distance between Arkady and Nikolai, between the father and son. And when Arkady is explaining to Nikolai and Pavel that Bazarov is a nihilist, they first don't know what the word means. They've never heard it before. But going from the Latin, they venture that it might be a man who declines to accept anything or to respect anything. These are their two guesses. And Arkady corrects them, saying that it's, quote, a man who treats things solely from the critical point of view, end quote. And they say, isn't that the same as what we said? And he says, no, quote, it's a man who declines to bow to authority or to accept any principle on trust, however sanctified it may be, end quote. And this is part of what makes Bazarov and his character and his ideology seductive, is that he's a critic of what can't justify itself, or that's what he purports to be. He's not interested in honoring a tradition just for its own sake. And remember, at this time in Russia, or at the time Turgenev was writing, some of these traditions might have included serfdom. Serfdom was only abolished in Russia in 1861, and this book was published in 1862. So there are powerful old institutions that may be worth scrutinizing in Russia at this time. And Bazarov at his best is somebody who is not afraid to criticize or to reject those established structures if he can't see the reasoning for them. And there's definitely something desirable or even ideal in that independent investigation, if that's what it is. Now, the trouble is that even somebody who starts out in this way, or a group of people who start out in this way, can very easily slip into an either equivalent or possibly much worse kind of unthinking, which is that the establishment unthinking maybe goes on with traditions and doesn't scrutinize them and doesn't think about what it's doing. The groupthink that could form is one that wants to destroy what is established, no matter what it is. So again, the independent thinking has been lost, and you have, in every case, a ready answer. Before, the ready answer was whatever is established is good, so we ought to keep doing that, and you don't investigate further. The new ready answer is that whatever is established is bad and needs to be destroyed, and with that ready answer in hand, you don't have to investigate further. And also, you become more likely to come to these kinds of conclusions, because that becomes the framework that you're operating under. Up to now, you've found many examples of why the established thing is bad and needs to be destroyed, and so now if you find an established thing that you think is worthwhile and that can stay, you imagine that that might be contradicting the rest of what you've been saying. Though it's not, but you also get into this problem of purity spiraling, which is that if you're around other people who also have this principle of destroying what's established as a compass of some kind, and if you are the one saying, well, I'm not sure, this tradition seems like it's fine and it could stay, and the other guy in the group says, you're one of them, you're a reactionary, then you have the group encouraging itself to be even more and more radical in this way. So you lose the independent thought that was valuable at the beginning. But so part of what makes this novel effective is that sometimes you're reading Bazarov and you find yourself agreeing with him, and other times you think he's an ignorant and dangerous blowhard. And by looking at this, we're really getting at the sweet spot, the optimized area of where a society can be in terms of tolerating new ideas and sustaining the structures that have given it life up to now. Because if you go too far in the one direction, the society fossilizes, it hardens, and may eventually be unable to change in a way that it needs to in order to keep up with its competitors, and it may be conquered for that reason. But on the other hand, if you let go of everything, or more accurately, if you are overrun and people who want to destroy everything get control, then you just have 1917 in Russia and everything that came after it. At another point, Bazarov, Arkady, Pavel, and Nikolai are talking, and we hear Bazarov saying a little bit more about what his position is. Arkady says, quote, "Both I and Bazarov have told you," he said, "that we recognize no authority of any sort. Rather, that we recognize no basis for action save the useful," corrected Bazarov. "At present, the course most useful is denial. Therefore, we deny." Deny everything? Deny everything. What? Both poetry and art, and I find it hard to express it. I repeat, everything, said Bazarov, with an ineffable expression of insouciance. Pavel Petrovitch stared. He had not quite expected this. For his part, Arkady reddened with pleasure. "Allow me," interposed Nikolai Petrovitch. "You say that you deny everything, rather that you would consign everything to destruction, but also you ought to construct." "That is not our business," said Bazarov. "First must the site be cleared." "Yes, for the present condition of the people demands it," affirmed Arkady. "And that demand we are bound to fulfill, seeing that no one has the right merely to devote himself to the satisfaction of his own personal egotism." With this last, Bazarov did not seem altogether pleased, since the phrase smacked too much of philosophy, rather of romanticism, as Bazarov termed that science, but he did not trouble to confute his pupil. "No, no," Pavel Petrovitch exclaimed with sudden heat. "I cannot believe that gentlemen of your type possess sufficient knowledge of the people to be rightful representatives of its demands and aspirations. For the Russian people is not what you think it to be. It holds traditions sacred and is patriarchal and cannot live without faith." "I will not dispute that," observed Bazarov. "Nay, I will even agree that you are right. And granting that I am right, you have proved nothing." "Yes, proved nothing," echoed Arkady with the assurance of a chess player who, having foreseen a dangerous move on the part of his opponent, awaits the attack with expert composure. "But how have I proved nothing?" muttered Pavel Petrovitch, rather taken aback. "Do you mean to say that you are opposed to, not in favor of, the people? Good gracious! Do not the common folk believe when it thunders that the prophet Elijah is going up to heaven in his chariot? You and I do not agree with that. The point is that the people is Russian, and that I am the same. Not after what you have just said. Henceforth must I decline to recognize you as any countryman of mine." With a sort of indolent haughtiness, Bazarov replied, "With his own hand did my grandfather guide the plough. Ask, therefore, of your favorite peasant which of us two, you or myself, he rates most truly as his countryman. Why, you do not even know how to speak to him. And you, while speaking to him, despise him. Should he merit contempt? Yes." End quote. And I'm realizing that reading that passage aloud is a little bit tricky because you can't always hear where one character's speech ends and the other one begins, but there are two things to take from this. One is that this depiction of nihilism takes even philosophy as romanticism. So this is a departure from the kind of reasoned criticism or examination of society that I was talking about earlier, because Bazarov might even say that the tools of philosophy are themselves not valid to use in an examination of society. So the point is not to have the most reasoned society that you can. It's just coming from nothing in order to unmake, or the modern descendants or advocates of this ideology might say dismantle or deconstruct, something that the nihilist cannot either understand or benefit from. But also we see here the nihilist contempt for the Russian people. Pavel asks, "Do you mean to say that you are opposed to, not in favor of, the people?" And Bazarov doesn't answer directly, but he gives an example of how he doesn't agree with the people, talking about their superstitious beliefs. And the passage closes by him saying that he despises the people if they merit contempt. So all of this is a piece of fiction written by one guy who was living at the time, but he happens to be one of the most famous novelists in history and certainly in Russian history. But he is far from characterizing this movement, which is later to become a major part of the Bolshevik Revolution, as some kind of populism. This is not a Russian peasants' revolt. This is a guy who has contempt for the populace, for the masses, as much as he does for anything else. And this next passage is a little longer, but I think you'll find that it's worth it. Later they're talking and Pavel says, quote, "You've decided merely to deny everything? We have decided merely to deny everything. And that you call nihilism? That we call nihilism." In Bazarov's repetition of Pavel Petrovich's words were echoed this time a note of pride. Pavel Petrovich knit his brows. So, he said in a voice that was curiously calm. Nihilism is designed to combat our every ill, and you alone are to act as our saviors and our heroes. Well. But in what consider you yourselves and your censorious friends to excel the rest of us? For you chatter as much as does everyone else. No, muttered Bazarov. At least we are not guilty of that, however we may err in other ways. You do things then. At all events, you are preparing to do things. Bazarov did not reply, although in his excitement, Pavel Petrovich had started up and then quickly recovered his self-command. Continued Pavel Petrovich. With you, to act is to demolish. But how is such demolition to benefit when you do not even know its purpose? We demolish because we are a force, interposed Arkady. Pavel Petrovich stared, then smiled. And a force need render account to no one, added Arkady, with a self-conscious straightening of his form. Fool, gasped Pavel Petrovich. Evidently he could contain himself no longer. Have you ever considered what you are maintaining with your miserable creed? Even an angel would lose patience. A force, forsooth. You might as well say that the wild Kalmuk or the barbaric Mongol represents a force. What boots such a force? Civilization and its fruits are what we value. And do not tell me that those fruits are to be overlooked, seeing that even the meanest piano player, whoever earned 5 kopecks a night, is of more use to society than you. For men of that kind at least stand for culture, rather than for some rude Mongolian propelling power. Yes, you may look upon yourselves as the coming race, yet you are fit but to sit in a Kalmuk shanty. A force, forsooth. Good and forceful sirs, I beg to tell you that you number but 4 men and a boy, whereas those others number millions, and are folk of the kind who will not permit such as you to trample upon their sacred beliefs, but will first trample upon your worthy selves. Let them trample upon us, retorted Bazarov. We are more in number than you think. What? You really believe that you will succeed in inoculating the nation as a whole? From a little candle, replied Bazarov, there arose, as you know, the Conflagration of Moscow. A pride almost satanic in its nature, and then banter. And thus you would seek to attract our youth. Thus you would attempt to win the inexperienced hearts of our boys. For sitting beside you is one of those very boys, and he is absolutely worshipping you. Upon this Arkady knit his brows and averted his head a little. Yes, the canker has spread far already. For instance, they tell me that in Rome our artists decline to enter the Vatican and look upon Raphael as next door to a fool, just because he is an authority. Yet those very artists are themselves so barren and impotent that their fancy cannot rise above girls at fountains, and so forth, villainously executed. And such artists you account fine fellows, I presume. Like those artists, said Bazarov, I consider Raphael to be worth not a copper groat. And as for the artists themselves, I appraise them at about a similar sum. Bravo, bravo, cried Pavel Petrovich. Listen, O Arkady, listen to the way in which the young men of the present day ought to express themselves. Surely our youth will now rally to your side. For once upon a time they had to go to school, since they did not like to be taken for dunces, and therefore worked at their studies. But now they have but to say everything in the world is rubbish, and behold, the trick is done. They consider that delightful, and naturally. In other words, the blockheads of former days are become the nihilists of the present. Your self-sufficiency, your self-respect, is carrying you away, Bazarov remarked nonchalantly. As for Arkady, his eyes had flashed and his whole form was quivering with indignation. But our dispute has gone far enough. Let us end it. Whenever you may feel that you can point out to me a single institution in our family or our public life which does not call for complete and unsparing rejection, I shall be pleased to accept your view. Of institutions of that kind I could cite you millions, exclaimed Pavel Petrovich. For example, take the village commune. Bazarov's lips twisted themselves into a contemptuous smile. The village commune, said he, is a subject which you would do better to discuss with your brother, since he is learning by experience the meaning of that commune, and of its circular guarantee, and its enforced sobriety and other contrivances. Take the family then. Yes, take the family, since at least among the peasantry, it is still a surviving institution. And that question, too, I should imagine were best not dissected by you in detail." End quote. So in that passage, we get another nice, round, clear definition of how Bazarov views nihilism. And then Arkady brings in this word force. He says, "We are a force." And Pavel says, "The Mongols are a force too. But don't worry, you guys are very few, and the people who are in favor of my view are very many, and they will trample over you before you can trample over them." And it's eerie. Bazarov says, "From a little candle arose the conflagration of Moscow." In this book published in 1862. And then Pavel talks about these artists who reject Raphael while they themselves are unable to make anything, much less anything like what Raphael made. And Bazarov says that he rejects Raphael and also those artists who reject Raphael. And he invites Pavel to name any institution in our family or public life which does not call for complete and unsparing rejection. And Pavel mentions the family, and Bazarov even rejects that. And in this next section, we hear from Bazarov this idea that if you can organize society correctly, then you can set up a situation such that the fact that a man be wise or stupid, good or bad, will cease to be of importance, as he says. Later, Bazarov is talking to another character, and she says, quote, "Think you then that there is no difference between the wise man and the fool, the good and the bad?" "No, I do not," replied Bazarov. "On the contrary, I believe that such differences do exist. The point is that they exist only as between the sound and the ailing. For instance, a consumptive's lungs are not as yours and mine, yet they have been fashioned precisely as our own have been. Also, whereas to a certain extent we know whence bodily disorders arise, moral disorders come of faulty education, the 1,001 follies with which the human brain is afflicted, in short, any irregular condition of the social body. Rectify that body, and moral sickness will soon cease to be." Speaking as though he were saying to himself, "Believe me or not as you like, it's all one to me," Bazarov drew his long fingers through his whiskers, while his eyes glowed like coals. "Then you think," pursued Anna Sergeyevna, "that once the social body has been rectified, stupid and evil people will cease to exist. At all events, once the social body is properly organized, the fact that a man be wise or stupid, good or bad, will cease to be of importance." "Ah, I understand. That is because we all possess an identical spleen." "Precisely so, madam." End quote. Those are some of the passages that I wanted to show you from Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev. We didn't get into the story at all, or how the events of the story maybe reflect on these conflicting worldviews, but in order to do that, I would have to give away some of the parts of the story that I think would, in this case, affect the reading of it, so I didn't want to do that. But so how can we take this novel in this historical context? How can we think about it? One way is as a kind of data point about an ideology that was emerging in Russia in the middle of the 19th century, articulated by a great writer who is reasonably objective about this topic. He's not proselytizing either for or against this ideology, but he saw it around him, and he thought it was a worthwhile topic for a novel. Not that this is the entire novel, but it's certainly a big part of it. And at the time that he was writing these scenes, where there are these guys talking about rejecting everything and destroying everything in order to clear the way for something else, and how if you could only build society the right way, individual imperfections could be made irrelevant. It's very easy now to connect these to Soviet ideology, but at the time that Turgenev was writing this, the Soviets were still 60 years in the future. The Bolsheviks, before they were in power, were only 40 years in the future. The RSDLP was some 35 years, and Narodnaya Volya, established in 1879, was 17 years in the future. So these things were coming. They were on their way. And we see in this novel the advance guard, that stage of this development. And I would not say that the Soviets and the Bolsheviks and the people who ordered the assassination of Tsar Alexander II were only the descendants of nihilists. There were certainly other groups and interests involved in all of those things. But if we can very carefully use a work of fiction as a historical document, and I've said this before, but to be totally clear about what I mean, I obviously am not talking about citing events in a work of fiction. For history, I'm talking about a writer at a certain time writing about a certain topic in a certain way, being one point in how we understand a certain period. We can use this novel as a record of Turgenev's view of a certain ideology in Russia at a certain time. And I think it's very valuable for that reason alone. It's also amazing for its literary merits and just as a novel. But as we call backward into history, as we might call into a dark forest and ask, what do you see over there? Turgenev answers and he says, well, here's what I see. I see these nihilists and here are some of the things that they're saying. And then we, with the benefit of hindsight, can connect that to later people and groups and ideas. And if I can close with a personal note here, first of all, thanks very much for listening all the way to the end of this. Your time and attention are very valuable, and I'm grateful that you find this thing that I'm doing here to be useful and worth that time and attention. And I know I have at least a few repeat listeners, some of whom have been wondering where I've been. I just want to emphasize that I remain committed to this project, even though the output has slowed a little bit recently. I've been using some of my very limited spare time for writing. Hopefully I'll be able to present that to you in some way before too long. That's been slowing me down a little bit in reading, but I will, until I'm dead, hold reading as a part of my life. So I'm glad to be able to share some of my reflections with thoughtful listeners like you. Another thing that slowed me down recently is I read several books that for one reason or another were not suitable to comment on in this way, but I also didn't want to stop reading them. So I read several books about which I didn't record any thoughts in this way. So I can't yet make a promise that now I'm going to be very steadily putting out one episode per week, though that was and remains my goal. I'm still trying to do that, but I've had some difficulty doing it lately, and I can't see why I won't continue to have some difficulty doing it. But the good news is I've already finished the book that I'm going to be talking about in the next episode, so that hopefully should come out without too much difficulty. But I wanted to emphasize that I'm here, I'm going to remain here, and I value your time and attention and loyalty, even though I cannot always release these episodes with the rhythm that I want to. And most of all, I'm very glad to know that there are people who value the culture and history and literature of Europe the way that I do. But I'll leave it there for now. Farewell until next time. Take care, and happy reading.